Hello, and thank you for watching my talk on the paper Improved Code Summarization via a Graph Neural Network. My name is Alexander Leclerc, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Notre Dame. I would also like to thank my co-authors, Sakib Haq, Lingfei Wu, and Colin McMillan for all the hard work that they did on this project. So what do we mean by source code summarization? Simply put, source code summarization is the task of generating a high-level description of source code. When programmers read code, they usually don't want to read the source code directly to figure out what it does. Developers use documentation to make understanding the code they write faster and easier. So instead of reading the code on the left to understand what it does, we use the documentation or summary to explain what the code does. Having well-written documentation is important because it has been shown to decrease the time it takes to understand code. This leads to shorter onboarding time for new developers, as well as better understanding of how to properly use that code in the future. So you may be asking, don't developers already write documentation, or why don't they just write better documentation? Well, for one, writing good documentation is hard and very time-consuming. Developers are focusing on producing new features, fixing bugs, or maintaining code bases, and often don't have the time or energy to write great documentation. Also, it may be difficult for developers to update large portions of documentation as code changes and evolves. For example, if you have a large code base with thousands of classes and you add a new class that changes the behavior of existing code, it is difficult to track down every place where documentation may need to be updated. One solution to this problem is to automate the documentation process. The work on source code summarization has been around for quite a while. In the early 2010s, extractive summarization techniques were popular and the term source code summarization was coined. These approaches mainly focused on using knowledge bases and information retrieval techniques to automatically fill out templates. Many of these approaches used algorithms such as TF-IDF, LDA, LSA, and even eye tracking to find important keywords in the source code to fill out summary templates. A few years later, neural networks and deep learning started becoming popular in machine translation and other natural language processing tasks, and software engineering researchers applied these techniques to source code. In 2016, IR used an off-the-shelf encoder-decoder attention model for source code summarization. Later, in 2018, WHO added in API information to the model and improved performance. The common thing between these early works is that they focused on the source code as a sequence of tokens as input to the model. Then, as things moved forward, researchers began looking at additional information that can be obtained from the source code. This led to a group of works that focused on how to use the abstract syntax tree for source code summarization. In 2018, WHO published their paper, Deep Code Comma Generation. In their work, they developed a structure-based traversal technique to generate a sequence of tokens from the AST that would preserve structure information. Then, in 2019, in my previous work, we utilized the structure-based traversal technique from WHO, but kept the source code sequence as a separate input from the AST. This allowed for the model to learn both sequence information from the source code and structure information from the AST. Also in 2019, Elon used an approach where they would take random paths through the AST and use that as input sequence for the model. These papers all utilized the AST, but developed a variety of methods for flattening it into a sequence. Around the same time, some groups started working with graph neural networks as a way to maintain relationships of tokens in the AST that are lost when you flatten it to a sequence. In 2019, Fernandez published a paper where they used a graph neural network and multiple edge types to encode the source code data. The direction of the work done in source code summarization in the last few years has really focused on how we represent source code to the neural network and what the best way to do that is. In this paper, we developed a new model using graph neural networks for source code summarization, as well as provide some insight into why and how this method improves performance. Here is a high-level overview of our project. We follow a standard machine learning pipeline where we start with a dataset. In this case, we used our FunCom dataset, which I will discuss in the next slide. We then generate our ASTs and do some light additional processing. Next, we train our model and run automated evaluation metrics. When comparing our approach to previous graph-based approaches, the major difference in contribution is that we found that having separate inputs for the source code sequence and AST improved the performance over combining them into a single input. For this project, we used a dataset that we published last year that consists of 2.1 million Java method comment pairs. What we did was take the first line of the Java doc and use only comments that are between 3 and 13 words long. This removes around 15% of the total comments, mainly consisting of single word summaries, which we found were not very useful when training a neural network. We also filtered out automatically generated code to help reduce leakage in our training, validation, and testing sets. On the slide is an example of an entry from the dataset. You can download the dataset with the unprocessed code and comments, or you can download a version that already has filtering and tokenization done so you can quickly prototype models. Here is a diagram of our model architecture. It follows a standard encoder-decoder model with attention. On the left, we have the inputs to our model. The source sequence, AST nodes, and AST edges are the input into our encoder, and the comment summary so far is the input to our decoder. Then we use an embedding layer to generate vectors for each of our tokens. We use the same embedding layer for both the source code and AST because they have such a large overlap in vocabulary, and it also slightly boosted performance. Then the AST nodes and edges go into the graph layers to generate better node embeddings for the AST tokens. The source code and decoder go directly to recurrent layers, and the output of our graph layers also are run through a recurrent layer. Then we apply attention to the source code and comment as well as the AST and comment, concatenate the outputs of the two attentions, and use that output to predict the next token in the summary. When using graph layers in a neural network, there are two key additional things we need to be mindful of. The first is how far away from each node we want to gather data. We call this the number of hops. And the second is how we aggregate that data. As an example, if we use this AST and focus on the node function, we see that its neighbors are unit, specifier, type, name, block, and parameter list. In our model, after the embedding layer, each of these tokens will be represented by a vector along with our edge input, which is an adjacency matrix. What the graph layer does is it collects the vectors for each neighboring node, as well as for the node itself, and combines that information. For our project, we summed these vectors together, multiplied by a set of weights, and applied an activation, and then generate a new set of vectors for each node that is based on its neighbors. But what if you want to bring in information from nodes that are more than one edge away? This is where the idea of hops comes in. Looking at a similar AST, if we want the function node to contain information from the public node, we need to do 2 hops so that the information can propagate 2 edges away. Also, we can have an arbitrary number of hops, which can be useful depending on how large our graphs are. Once we have the node vectors of the neighbors, there are many approaches to aggregating the data. As I said before, we simply sum the vectors together, but you could apply a recurrent layer, multiply them, take the max, etc. There has been quite a bit of work looking at aggregation strategies and which ones perform the best. And here is our experiment setup. We trained our models each to 10 epochs and tested on the models that had the highest validation accuracy. We did not perform hyperparameter optimization, but we did experiments to determine how the number of hops affected performance. Then for evaluation, we used blue and rouge automated metrics. Now on to results. To start, at the top of the table are our baseline models we used for comparison. We chose models to cover as many bases as possible. We chose to use AST-Attend-GRU and code-to-sequence to compare against models that use a flattened AST as input into the model, while graph-to-seq and BiLSTM, GNN, LSTM use graph neural networks to embed the AST. As you can see, the best performing baseline was the BiLSTM, GNN, LSTM with a 19.05 blue. For our proposed models, we trained 3 different model architectures. The 3 models that we trained and tested differed by changing the layer directly after the graph layers. We did this to see what effect, if any, that the layer played in performance. The first being code GNN dense, where a dense layer was applied to the output of the graph layer to determine if the recurrent layer after the graph layer was necessary. Then, the second model we trained, we did code GNN GRU, where GRU layer was applied right after the graph layer. And the third model we trained was a bidirectional LSTM layer. We found that the BiLSTM with 2 hops had the best blue performance, while the single hop GRU had the best rouge performance. We think this is due to the fact that the code GNN GRU model predicted longer sequences. This means it has a better chance of predicting words that appear in the reference, increasing rouge score and blue 4, but it also overpredicts words that do not appear, which can reduce overall BLEU score. We also found that the number of hops had a small effect on performance of our models, with 1 to 2 hops performing the best. We think this is due to the ASTs being generally small and having localized information, or information that is important to a node lives close by, but this may be very data dependent. Let me briefly go over an example that helps to show how the separate source and AST inputs help the model learn better source code representations. For this example, on the left-hand side, we have the reference and predicted summaries from our CodeGNN-GRU model, as well as a model that uses a flattened AST. Below that is the source code that was used to generate this example. On the right, we have visualizations of the attention mechanisms for both models. The top two are the source comment and AST comment attentions for the CodeGNN-GRU model, and the bottom two are for the AST attend-GRU model. So let's take a look at what the CodeGNN-GRU model is attending to when trying to predict the first token in the sequence. Here we compare the source comment attention of the CodeGNN-GRU model on top and AST attend-GRU model on the bottom. Both of these models attended to the source code in a very similar way. This is interesting because the AST attend-GRU model predicted the wrong token, but the CodeGNN-GRU did not. Looking at the AST comment attention, we see big differences. The CodeGNN-GRU model attended to the tokens send and status, while AST attend-GRU is focusing on the token expression statement. One explanation for this is that CodeGNN-GRU is able to combine structural and code elements better than models that don't utilize graph layers. In the context of this example, what this means is that the AST token send in the CodeGNN-GRU model is a learned combination of the send node and its neighbors, which in this AST are the nodes name, status, bar, and info. The AST attend-GRU model only sees the AST as a sequence of tokens, so when it attends to the token expression statement, its neighboring tokens are block and expression. Another observation from this example is that generally, the AST attend-GRU model activates more on the AST sequence than it does on the source code sequence, while CodeGNN-GRU activates similarly on both attentions and focuses more on specific tokens. This could be due to the graph layers learning more specific structure information from the AST. We also found that when the CodeGNN-GRU model source and AST attention focused on the same or similar tokens, it overwhelmingly would select that token as the next predicted token in the comment sequence. This is likely working as a form of copy mechanism, allowing the model to select tokens directly from the source code or AST. So, in summary, we found that encoding the source code and AST separately improves model performance and allows the model to learn additional information from the AST. It also seems to give the model a form of copy mechanism to choose tokens directly from the source or AST as the next predicted token. We also found that for these ASTs, the number of hops had a minor effect on performance with less than 1 full BLEU score difference between our best and worst tests. Again, this hyperparameter may be very data dependent, so larger graphs or different aggregation methods may perform differently based on the number of hops. We also found that using graph layers to encode the AST outperforms flattened AST approaches. This is likely due to the information that is lost when you flatten an AST. Thank you all for listening to my talk. The code used in this paper can be downloaded at the link at the top of the page, and the dataset can be downloaded at the link in the middle. Please feel free to reach out to me via email if you have any questions. I also want to thank the organizers for all the hard work they have put in to make this conference happen with the current state of the world and the pandemic.